Okay, so welcome everyone. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alexandra and I'm one of the programming staff at Pickering Public Library, and we are very happy and excited to have storyteller Kesha Christie with us here tonight. So just a few things before we get started. This program is being recorded for our YouTube page, just so you know. And then at the end of the session tonight, we'll have a few minutes for some questions. So if you think of any questions during the program tonight, feel free to drop those in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have a few minutes for some questions. So just a little bit about Kesha before we get started tonight. Kesha Christie is a dynamic storyteller and passionate motivational speaker. She proudly shares Caribbean folklore, West African tales, and original stories that hook listeners and ignite the imagination. Some of Kesha's recent accolades include participating in Storytellers of Canada's Stories from the Motherlands and Many Lands, being a finalist in the 2020 Ntakuma Anansi Soundsplash Storytelling Conference and Festival, as well as launching a weekly storytelling podcast called What Good. And What Good is available on many podcast platforms such as iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Google Podcast as well. And then Kesha is also the founder of an annual Storyteller event celebrating our stories and the way we tell them. And she also showcases local entrepreneurs in that as well. And then to find out more about Kesha, you can visit her website, which is www.talkintales.ca, or you can subscribe to Talkin Tales on YouTube or follow her on Instagram at talkin_tales. And I'll put all those links in the chat as well for everyone to access later. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kesha Christie.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Good evening, everyone. I'd also like to thank the Pickering Public Library for hosting this event and giving me the opportunity to spend time with you this evening. I know that you could be anywhere or in a line trying to get somewhere, so I'm really happy that we have this time to share it together. I wanted to touch on a few things. So we're gonna, if you can, put your cameras on. As a storyteller, it's so amazing to be able to share space with the audience and be able to see facial expressions and reactions. And although we're doing things a little bit differently today, it'll be great to see your wonderful faces. So feel free to turn your cameras on, but keep yourself muted. We'll have a chance at the end to open up mics and share some conversation. And we're going to use the emojis or the reactions on the Zoom today. So down at the bottom, there's a button that says reactions, or if you're on your phone, the three dots, if you click on that, you'll see the reactions. So you'll see like hand clapping, smiley face, balloons and things like that. So feel free to use those. If there's a great part of the story that you're really loving, feel free to use those. Also in the chat, you can put in your comments. If you want to hear something again, great story, or you have a question, put them there. So we're going to have a great conversation about stories and storytelling. Stories connect us all. As a community, as individuals, we tell stories all the time. Each one of us is a storyteller. So where do stories come from? Some stories have no author. The stories that I love to tell are called folk tales. And these are the stories that are passed down from generation to generation, the way that we're gathered here today. Families would gather together, villages would gather together, and they would share stories. The storyteller is seen as the teacher, the historian, musician, poet. They'd had so much responsibilities. They could tell you stories about who you were, who your family is, and where you came from. They were advisors to kings about where life was once, what life is now, and where things could be. They were very, very important. And storytellers all have different names depending on which country you're from and depending on how far back you go. For example, in Africa, storytellers are known as griots, and they often have instruments, or they would often dress in a certain way so you would know. But not anybody could be a storyteller. It was something that was also passed down from generation to generation. So if your father was a storyteller, then the likelihood is that you would become one too. Well, nowadays, everyone can tell stories. This is how we do it. We tell stories by taking a picture and posting it online, or we do live videos and we share little pieces of our lives. But folk tales are those stories where we don't know who originally wrote the story, but they all have a message, a moral, or a lesson. And it doesn't matter how many different generations hear these stories, they are all relevant. Somehow, the message affects our daily lives today. And that's why these folk tales are so special. And I feel the same way about folk songs as well as folk dress as well. But tonight I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you where all stories came from, but I can tell you where a certain set of stories came from. You see, there is a character by the name of Anansi. Anansi, he is a mythical creature with the face of a man and the body of a spider. Where does Anansi come from? Well, Anansi was founded or fashioned in West Africa, the area that we now know as Ghana. And the Akan or the Ashanti people fashioned him after their spider god. Now, Anansi, he is quite the character. He was very sharp, very smart, did a lot of interesting things to get himself in and out of trouble. But every so often, one of his little tricks benefited everyone around him. And this is that story. This story is called All Stories Belong to Anansi. A very, very long time ago, Anansi was looking down on the world. And he saw that the people worked outdoors, they would build fires and cook food and spend time together. But when they gathered in the evening and sat around the fire, they didn't do anything. They just sat. And Nancy thought to himself, there must be something else that the people could do. That's when he got an idea. And Nancy decided that he was going to go up into the sky and visit the sky god, Nyame. See, Nyame had all of the world's stories. He had put all of the stories in a box and covered it and put it under his throne. Well, Anansi decided that he was going to get those stories. So he fashioned a web and made his way up into the sky. And when he sought an attendance before the sky god, Nami laughed. Anansi, what could you want from me? Ah, Nyame, I want your stories. Anansi, many have come before you seeking my stories. What makes you think you can afford the price? He thought about it for a moment. See, Anansi was very small, this tiny spider. How could he do it? But he didn't know the price. I can do it. You don't know the price. You have to bring 3 things. First, Onini, the serpent who can eat a goat whole. Number 2, you need to bring Osebo. His teeth are as sharp as spears. And 3, Morabo, hornets whose sting is like fire. And Nancy thought about it for a moment. But the people needed the stories. And Nancy agreed. And off he went. On his way back down to earth, Anansi had to come up with a plan. Because all of the things that Nyame wanted were much bigger than he was. Nancy went home and spoke to the one person who would have some advice that he could use, his wife. The two of them sat for most of the night planning and talking. And by morning, Nancy had a plan. He walked out of his house and walked through the forest and found a long, thick stick of bamboo. And though Anansi was small, he was mighty. So he picked up that stick and began walking through the forest, muttering to himself, saying things like, she can't be right. I must be right. No, it doesn't make any sense. And he went on, muttering to himself. Well, Onini was close by, and he saw Anansi and his foolishness and decided to find out exactly what was going on. Anansi, why are you talking to yourself? Oh, I'm not talking to myself. My wife and I are having an argument, and I'm just not sure how to prove that I'm right. She says that you are shorter and weaker than this stick, but I think you are stronger and longer. But how do I prove myself right? That's easy, Anansi. Put your stick down and I will lie next to it. So Anansi did. And Onini laid beside it. I can't really tell. You see, when I think you are, you move your tail. And then when I look again, you move your head. Maybe it's best I tie you to the stick, and then I can know for sure. Onini agreed. So Anansi tied a string around his tail, around his middle, around his head, and a few other places while he was at it. And when he was done, Anansi started to laugh. You are caught. He picked up the stick of bamboo and took it up to Nyame. Nyame smiled. But Anansi had more work to do. So he went back down, and this time he needed to have a special plan in order to get Sable, the leopard, the hunter. But Anansi knew a few things. Sable took the same path to hunt every night. And so Anansi went along that path and dug a hole. He dug up so much dirt you wouldn't even be able to imagine. There was mud everywhere. But when he was done, he covered the hole with leaves and sticks and a little bit of dirt. When Anansi was satisfied with himself, he went home. That night, Osebo came lurking. He was hunting, and sleekly and easily he was walking down that path. And he continued and continued until he fell into the hole. And Osebo looked around, and there was no way that he could get out by himself. He had to wait till morning. It was a very long night. Well, Anansi came by the next morning and looked into the hole. Osebo, how did you get down there? Anansi, can't you see I'm stuck? Get me out. Will you eat me and my family? No, no, just get me out. So Nancy looked around and he saw a tall tree. It was a young tree, which means it could be bent all the way down. So Nancy bent the tree down and tied a string on both ends. And then he lowered string into the hole and said, tie this around your tail. And then he took the other end of that string and tied it to the end of the tree. When both ends were secure, Anansi cut the ropes, and up flew the tree, and up flew Osebo, bouncing around. He was so dizzy, and while Osebo was dizzy, Anansi fashioned his web and wrapped it all around his body. And then he took Osebo and went back to Nyame. And Nyame saw that Anansi had two of the items. You have one more thing to get. Off Anansi went, back down to the earth. This time, he needed to have a real special plan to get Murabu. So Anansi plucked a gourd. It was plump and round, and it had a thin stem. And he cut out the top, and then he hollowed out the inside of all of its goodness. He'll save it for later. And then he cleaned out the inside, washed it really well, and let it get hard. It got really hard, and Anansi filled it with water. And then he went to Murabu's nest. Hornets with a sting like fire. But Anansi was certain his plan was good. So he went to the nest and he poured water on himself. And then he took the rest of the water and poured it all over the nest. And you could hear Morabo and his family were mad. Zzz. Well, Anansi stood close by with a large leaf over his head, and he waited for them to come. Morabo and his family came out of that nest so fast, zing, 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 and they buzzed around. And Nancy said, "Oh, rainy season must have come early," very loud and very clear. Morabo came buzzing around to see what Anansi was talking about. Anansi looked at his nest and said, "Oh, your nest is all wet. What will you do?" "Ah, maybe you'll stay in my gourd until your home is dry again." Morabo, wet and angry, decided it was a good deal and went into the gourd. Zing, 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 zing. All the hornets went inside. And when the last one flew in, Anansi took the leaf, crumpled it up, and stuffed it in the top. And then he took the gourd up to Nyame. "Anansi, I told you I wanted Morabo and his family, and you bring me a gourd." Shake. Zzz. "Anansi, you have done what none before you. Warriors have come and failed, yet you, tiny little you, have come and paid the price for my stories." Nyame took out the stories. "Anansi, from this day on, these stories will be known as your stories, and anyone who tells these stories must acknowledge that these stories come from you." "Thank you, thank you." Anansi took the stories. And Anansi came back down to the earth. And as the people sat around the fire with nothing to do, Anansi shared the stories. "You get one, you get one, you get one." And he shared those stories. And the people told stories regularly. They told stories to their friends, their family, their children, their children's children, and they went on and on and on telling these stories. So that even today, when you go to Africa, they will tell you about spider stories. Well, now they all know about spider stories, and now I've told one to you. So please go out and share them too. Oh, wonderful. I'm glad you enjoyed that story. Awesome. Now I'm going to share with you a little bit about the difference between reading and telling. Because we often talk about storytelling, and then I get the question, what book will you read? Well, I don't read, but let's find out what the difference is. I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through it together. Wonderful. All right. So let's go to read or tell. I'm going to bring up a fable, an Aesop fable, and I'm going to read you the story and then I'm going to tell it. So this story is about two pots. Two pots, one of brass and the other of clay, stood together on a hearthstone. One day, the brass pot said, "Let's go out and see the world." But the earthen pot excused himself. "No, no, no, no. It could take very little to break," he said. "You know how fragile I am. I can't go with you." "Do not let that keep you home," urged the brass pot. "I will take care of you." Well, after some convincing, the earthen pot went, and the two went out side by side. But after some time, some jostling, we all know what happens here. They bumped together. They bumped again a few steps later, and of course, the earthen pot or the clay pot did not survive, and their friendship was over. The pot cracked, and then it went into 1,000 pieces. So the moral of this fable is that equals make the best friends. I'm going to tell you that story again, but this time, instead of reading it, I'm going to tell it. And let me know in the comments how the story makes you feel. This is a tale of two friends, two pots that lived very happily together. There's the clay pot and the brass pot. But the brass pot wanted to go out and see the world. Yet the clay pot was afraid. No, I can't go out into the world. I could break. After some convincing, the two were out, went off to see the world. They traveled along smooth road. They traveled along grassy knolls, and they traveled along bumpy roads. And of course, the clay pot was still afraid. And when the first bump happened, the clay pot got a crack. No, no, we must go back. We must go back. The brass pot said, no, I will take care of you. Come with me. Let's see the world. And they continued a little further. But the clay pot was so afraid of breaking that they bumped together. And the clay pot cracked. That crack grew bigger. And then it fell into 1,000 pieces. And there it was. The brass pot put the clay pieces inside of it and still went to see the world. The moral of this story is that some friends are better as equals than not. How does the story make you feel? You can put up some emojis, see what the difference is. When you read the story, you're more stuck to the paper. You're focusing on the words. But when you tell the story in your own words, you're able to add, you're able to paint a picture, you're able to make it more than what is just on the paper. And you can pick how you want to share the story. You could tell the story and narrate the story like I did, or you could even tell that story from the perspective of a pot, either the brass or the clay pot. Either way, you take control of the story. So if you've decided to choose your story and you're getting ready to share it, how do you remember? As a storyteller, there are so many stories, and I often get the question, how do you remember all those stories? Honestly, I don't. You have to practice your story. So once you've selected the story that you want to share or the story that you want to tell, you want to make sure that you practice your story. And the easiest way to remember your story depends on you. For example, you could remember the 3 points. Remember what the climax is, remember what the solution is, and then you can fashion your tale in between to get to the conclusion. Or you can draw pictures. Now, we're not all artists, and I certainly am not, but stick people work just fine. You can draw stick figures to make the main pictures of your story. And that way, the more you practice, the more you remember the bigger part of the story. Because as a storyteller, you are retelling the story from your imagination. So if the sky is blue until it turns a gold and yellow and red as the sun begins to set, when you say it that way, your audience sees it too. When you tell your story and you are looking at a building, you can set a scene before you begin your story. So your audience is already in the valley with you, or the garden, or the tavern, depending on where your setting is. You can create all of that with your words and then begin your story, because that way your audience is already there. Some other ways that you can do it is that you can form your story around different things. We talked about creating the scene. You could also create the character. A lot of the stories that I tell are about Anansi. So I could paint Anansi in any ways. I often say that he has the face of a man and the body of a spider. I could talk about his 8 long legs. I could talk about how he's dressed. And really, it would depend on the story. You can also take your character and remember 3 specific things about your character. For example, if your character is a goat, you want to kind of see how goats move, and you could move in that way. Or you could sound like a goat. I think I'm going to sound like a sheep. Bah, bah, why are we here? You could use that voice. but it would depend on your character. So you can base your story around that. Or you can base your story around the theme. So if it's a ball and it is a birthday party, you can surround your story around that. So now if you're telling your story, you're in the middle of your story, you're passionate about it, it sounds wonderful, and then you forgot a part of the story. It happens. It really does. What do you do? Well, there are a few ways you can handle it. One, you could say, oh, wait. Sorry, let's go back. But if you do that, then it's kind of like listening to music and then somebody calls your name and you take out your earbuds. Your audience is now disconnected to the story or from the story. There's a better way to do it. You can find a way to weave that piece back into your story. For example, if your character was going to a specific place before they got to the ball, but they got to the ball first, you can say, not to mention, Bill remembered when he needed to be in the tavern and picked up the cup. So when he reached into his pocket, he found the cup that he retrieved from the tavern. Without telling your audience, we're going back. You could even skip it all together if it is not a big part of the story. For example, if we're talking about the sword and the stone, if it isn't the part where the sword comes out of the stone, you can decide whether it really needs to be told. But you need to just prepare yourself by practicing. The more you practice your story, the more you'll feel comfortable telling more, telling less, and you'll know exactly what to cut and where there are details that you can add in. What I've noticed or what I've learned in telling stories is that if 5 tellers tell you the same story, you're getting 5 different tales because each teller tells it from their perspective. And with the podcast that I have, Walk Good, I tell Caribbean folk tales. And the funny thing is that each island has a very similar folk tale. The characters might be different or not, but the references are pretty much the same. Earlier this year, I did a presentation with Sandra Whiting, where she told the Jamaican version of a Nancy story, and I told the Bahamian version. It was a similar story, but one was about a Nancy and tiger, and the other was about Babuki and Barabi. And it was the same circumstance. Both were fighting over a woman. And both, at the end of the day, ended up showing up as a riding horse. Funny things happen like that. So now that you've found your story, you've practiced your story, you've figured out what angle you want to tell your story from, and now you're prepared, you're ready to go. How do you implement all of these things together? I like to use storyboards. You could draw it out with the stick people. I love to record. I would record my story so I can listen to it like a podcast. I can listen to it on my phone, on my computer, wherever I go. So the next time that I'm performing, I've heard the story enough times that I can add here. If the story is shorter than I need to, for example, sometimes you go to presentations and you think you have 5 minutes, but now you only have 3. You know exactly where to shorten to meet that time frame. Or it could be the opposite. There's a lot of time and you were asked to step in early. You know how to bring the story out without taking away from the audience. I'm going to share another folktale with you. This one is called, let's share the screen. All right. So this folktale, it's not a folktale, it is a fable. And so what's the difference? Folktales consist of fables, which are usually about animals with human characteristics, or myths, which are usually stories about heroes doing great things, as well as the fairy tales that we typically know, the Cinderella, Once Upon a Time type stories. Well, this next story I'm going to share with you is called The Crow and the Pitcher. Long ago, there was a drought. The ground was so dry. The sand barely moved, but it was so dusty, and the crow had been flying for some time, looking for water. Flying high, flying low, unable to find water, and feeling so thirsty. Finally, the crow spots a pitcher left out by someone under a tree. What luck! He flew down and stood beside the pitcher, and yes, there's water in the pitcher. So he stuck his beak inside. Air. So he stuck it in again. Ugh, still can't get the water. But my throat's so dry. Looked around, and all the crow could find were stones, little stones. So he picked one up and dropped it in the pitcher. Plunk. Picked up another stone and dropped it in the pitcher. Plunk. So the crow put more and more and more and more, and then the clunk got softer and softer and softer. So he stuck his beak back into the pitcher and the crow was able to drink all of the water and satisfy his thirst. It's not every day that one can be so lucky. The moral of this story is, in a good pitcher can be used, and sometimes you got to use your brain, or as we have a proverb in the Caribbean that says, common sense make before book sense. And so that just basically brings us to, what do you do now? You now have your story. You've picked your story. You're going to be telling your story in front of your class, in front of a group of people, whether it be an association or even in a Zoom link like this. You know your story. You've written it out, or you've recorded it. You've practiced. You're ready. Let's talk a little bit about performance technique. Let's do that. All right, so performance technique. There are 3 pieces that you can focus on. This workshop is light. We don't go into a lot of details, but these 3 things will help get you started and prepare you for any story that you're going to tell, whether it be casually with friends or a heavy duty story that you need to be as part of a presentation or in a professional environment. So there are 3 things that you need to keep in mind. The first one is tell the story in your own words. When I read the fable earlier, it was kind of rough because now you're focusing on each word. It wasn't the way that I talked, so it seemed a little bit rough. When you tell the story from your own perspective, using your own language, you draw in your audience. You keep their attention. You can bring them in by doing different things. There are ways to open a story and ways to close a story. And in the Caribbean, you'll often hear a storyteller will call out crick and the audience will call back crack. And the way that they say the crack determines how long the story will be, or if it'll be more than one story. So you'll often hear crick and the audience will cry crack, and that brings this connection between the teller and the audience. And then the storyteller will begin the story in their own words. So you always want to tell your story in your own words. For example, if your story is an old story and they use words like hither and funny words for drinks, if you don't speak that way normally, you might lose your audience. You might have one person way in the back who knows what you're talking about, but you want to keep everyone connected. So tell them like it is. It was a cold cup of chocolate milk or a cold cup of lemonade. Use your language, and it'll keep you connected to your audience. Number 2 is eye contact. When you think of eye contact, when we're here on Zoom, it's easy to stay focused in certain places. But as a storyteller, you want to be ready for anything, and you want to include your whole audience. So when you think of eye contact, it's really three things. The first one is that you want to look at your audience. You want to then look at the story. So if someone's speaking, you can look at the story. And then you want to look beyond the story. So you want to look out into your audience. When you look out over your audience, it brings them in because they feel like they're a part of that story. So if you're talking about walking through the forest and seeing a spider creep crawling up the tree, and then you hear a monkey in the background, and you're looking for that monkey way over there. Woo! What lovely black fur. Now your audience is thinking, oh, I want to see it too. You're bringing them inside your story. Number three is vocal variety. When we present, we often talk one way, and when we read, we sound another way. But when you're performing, you want to have vocal variety. You're building your story so you can easily use volume to build up to your climax, and then you can help your audience know that you're concluding your story by coming back down the other side and changing your tone. You can use voices, you can use sound effects. You want to just use a little bit of variety. Change it just a little bit so that your audience stays connected. They're following you through the story. They're walking through the forest with you as you build and share your tale. So once you focused on those three items, you will be able to tell an amazing story. You've practiced your story, you're telling it in your own words, and now you're able to use these few performance techniques in order to be able to bring it out and make it your own. Make it an amazing story by just sharing. That's all you want to do, is really include your audience in all things. So I talked a little bit about the call and response. There are a lot of stories that begin in a certain way. For example, when you hear Once Upon a Time, you know that you're going to be getting a traditional folk tale, usually a Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, even a Rapunzel. But depending on where your story comes from, they will start a little bit differently. For example, there are many African tales that start in many different ways. For example, the teller might say, I'm old, but I see. And now you see. Or they may start a story that says, many long years ago, or a long time ago when. And there's also the call and response. In the Caribbean, there are differences. For example, in Antigua, they have itty quick, the teller would say, and the audience would respond, itty quack. Now, we also have the traditional that I like to hear, and I find it the most easiest when I'm really, really nervous and I'm going to share a story. I will take the role and I will call out crick, and the audience will reply crack. So you always want to tell the audience what their role is so that they can jump in and participate. And if you're ever telling a story and you find that you might have lost your audience, or you're feeling like you're not as connected as you want to be with your audience, you want to bring them back, then you cry out crick and they'll reply crack, and you do it a few more times to bring everybody engaged, bring them back in. Exactly. You'll keep them engaged. So there are a number of different ways to do that. But also, there's a way to end your story. A lot of the Anansi stories I love to tell because Anansi is the biggest trickster ever. But I also like that I cannot take responsibility for the story. What does that mean? It means when I tell the Jamaican version of these stories, I always say, Jack Mandora, me not choose none. And that basically means I'm not responsible for any of the trickery in the story. It gives me an opportunity to let it go, and the audience can take that story and again retell that story, and they won't be responsible for that one either. There's a whole bunch of mischief that happens in stories, and that's just the way life was. A lot of these stories were used to teach lessons, to inspire, to be fortitude, or to create a sense of community. So a lot of times the bad guy can't always win. There has to be someone that teaches them a lesson. And these stories that have trickster characters, which can vary. I love Anansi stories, but there are also other stories such as Babuki and Barabi. There are Brer Rabbit stories. They all have a trickster character, and they all have trickster characteristics about them that teach lessons as well as give you a little bit of fun while you're through the story. So now, for all the parents who may not like the story, or for those who may have gotten a little mischievous with the tale, they can always avoid responsibility by saying "Jack Mandora, mina choose none," or the other ways that there are to end a story. So when you end your story, you never have to really say the end, because does the story really end? They continue to go on and on as we keep sharing. What I love about the stories are that they connect us. They keep us connected, and they help us remember our ancestors, remember our parents, remember our parents' parents, or we are able to look at our family members a little bit differently. Some stories are personal stories. There are storytellers that tell you about their family or experiences, and it helps you to see that Auntie Janice a little bit differently. You see Auntie Janice without her title of Auntie, and you realize that she's a woman who went to work one day and the funniest thing happened. You're able to understand or experience those stories a little bit differently from a personal perspective. When you share stories, there are a couple of ways to do it. We talked about being a narrator by standing outside of the story and telling what happens as it happens. But you could also tell the story from the perspective of your character, or maybe even a friend of your character, where you're able to talk about how the character feels and what they're going through, and that adds a whole different dimension to the story. And also, you could tell a story without dialogue, or you could do a majority of your story with dialogue. So instead of saying he said, she said, you just talk and you look down if your character is bigger, you look up if your character is smaller, or you can change positions depending on what ability you have or the space that you have available to you. When you're on Zoom, looking in the different places will help be able to bring the audience in, because now they can recognize who's talking without hearing that he said and then she said. So it adds a different dimension to that. You can also make your story very visual, because really the story is coming out from your imagination and you're using your own words. So you want to be descriptive. And if you're not setting the scene, or it's just a narrated story, you still want to add a little bit of juice, a little bit of spice that will allow the audience to laugh at a joke that you've made up or as a part of the story, or you can have them experience that sad moment with you. But the same way you build up to that climax, you also want to be able to release it. But you don't want to wait till the end in order to bring the audience back down. You want to give them little breaks in between so that your story has a natural flow, a natural vibe. And that just kind of helps to keep everyone together and connected. I want to share a quote with you. There we go. This quote basically says, "It is not the storyteller's job to convince their audience of anything. Their only responsibility is to show a different perspective." This quote is from Dr. Amina Blackwood Meeks, and she is a Jamaican storyteller and the creator of the Anansi Soundsplash. She's recently put together a storytelling course which runs through the University of the West Indies. And it's all about thinking about how stories are told, their perspective. And for example, if you're telling a story that is cultural in background, for example, you're telling a story from where you're from. And if it's an older story, meaning it's before your time, you don't want to put a cell phone in there. You want to make sure that you're aware of what was happening during that time so that you can talk about the streetcar or you can talk about the building of a car, depending on the time that is the timing of your story, the decade. You want to be able to understand that. And sometimes those of us who are blessed to still have grandparents with us or great grands or beyond, they will share stories with you. And it might be a small part of a story. And I remember I was doing the online stuff and I found a story that I thought was so amazing. It was 2 lines long. And so then I had to go and I had to do a little bit of research about the island, the time, so that I could fill in the gap. If you get stories that are a little light on the details, if you know a little bit of the history, a little bit of the culture, you're able to add to it and make it a little bit more. You can add to that and make it bold and make it stronger. I'm going to conclude with a story that I recently found. It's a West African folk tale, and it is a very interesting one. It is, no, I'm going to tell a story that we're all familiar with. This story is a story that we have all heard, but maybe not in this way. This story is called The Tortoise, the Hare, and the Elephant. Long ago, all of the animals were preparing for a foot race. They wanted to know who was the fastest. And on this day, Elephant was the fastest. The Hare said, "Oh, no, 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 no. We're going to have to do this over because I am definitely faster than you." And Tortoise spoke up. "I am faster than both of you." Well, of course, a new date was set. The king declared the new date, and the line was drawn in the sand, and everyone went away to prepare for the race. Well, race day arrived, and on the starting line, there was Elephant, there was the Tortoise, and there was the Hare, all ready to go. On your mark, get set, and they were off, racing as fast as they could. Or at least that's what we thought. Well, the Hare was going, he was going, he was going, and the Elephant was going, he was going. And when he looked back, he was definitely faster than the Tortoise. And when the Hare looked, he was faster. He was 1,000 times faster than the Elephant and 1,000,000 times faster than the Tortoise. Except for a funny thing. When he looked back, he didn't see the Tortoise, but there was something just up ahead. Could that be Tortoise? It was Tortoise, and he was playing mahjong. What? Playing a game, and they were in the middle of a race? The Hare ran even faster because that couldn't be. Well, now Elephant was way in the distance, and the Hare was still going. And again, he looked up and saw, what is that? Is that Tortoise eating lunch? Impossible. The Hare kept running as fast as he could. And then he could see the finish line. There it was. The crowds were waiting for him to cross the line. But there was something on the line. He kept going. He kept going. He saw a rock on the finish line, but he didn't mind it. The Hare kept going and going and going and going. And wait a minute, the closer he got to the finish line, he saw that that rock had 4 legs. 4 legs. And no, that couldn't be. It was Tortoise crossing the finish line, and Hare was still behind. This is impossible. But the crowds cheered. Ah, ah. Tortoise won the race. Hare thought, something is wrong. Something has to be wrong. I am 1,000 times faster than the Elephant, and I've got to be 1,000,000 times faster than the Tortoise. Well, Tortoise just smiled and collected the reward. Until this day, nobody knew that the Tortoise asked for a little help While he was running the race, he called together all of his friends, all of his cousins, all of his uncles, and said, I'm going to need your help on this one. So no one ended up knowing that the tortoise that started the race was not the same one that finished it. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Kesha.
To you.
That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing the stories with us, and thank you for teaching us how to tell stories and memorize and perform them. That was great.
Awesome.
Great. Okay. Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight, and thank you again to Kesha for this wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm so happy that I was able to participate this evening and be able to share with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you again.